Friday nights were usually noise for us, friends dropping by or obligations we pretended were rest, so the quiet felt borrowed, like we were living someone else's life for a few hours, sitting on the couch in our Boston apartment with cardboard containers spread across the coffee table, low main cooling too fast, the TV muted because we were talking for once, or at least I thought we were. Vanessa was still dressed for work, heels kicked off near the door, blazer folded with careful precision on the chair like she might need it again in 5 minutes, and I remember noticing how composed she looked, how calm, which should have been my first warning, because she had always worn stress loudly, tapping fingers, pacing, complaining about emails at dinner. Halfway through the meal she stopped eating, wiped her mouth, and said my name the way people do when they've already rehearsed what comes next, and then she told me she'd been offered a VP position at a major firm in Chicago, said it cleanly, efficiently, like she was reading a line from a presentation deck, and before I could even process the geography she added the real part, the part she clearly thought mattered more, that she couldn't do both, that the job and the marriage couldn't exist in the same space. There was no build-up, no apology tour, no dramatic pause, just a statement of fact delivered with the same tone she used to explain quarterly projections, and she said that her career dreams didn't align with the life I wanted, that she'd tried to picture a future where she stayed, where we compromised, and every version of it felt like suffocation to her. I waited for the rush of heat people talk about, the urge to argue or bargain or ask questions, but none of it came, and instead there was this strange stillness, like something had finally stopped humming in the background. I looked at her, at the woman I'd built routines and assumptions around, and realized she wasn't asking me anything, she was informing me, and for the first time I understood that whatever decision existed had already been made before the takeout was ordered. So I said okay, not softly, not angrily, just okay, take the job, and the words surprised both of us because they landed heavier than any plea would have. She searched my face for something, maybe anger or sadness or a crack she could lean into, but I didn't give her one, because in that moment detachment felt safer than hope, and I could feel myself stepping back emotionally, like someone quietly closing a door without slamming it. I didn't cry, I didn't ask what Chicago apartments cost or how often we'd visit, because the conversation wasn't about logistics, it was about an ending she'd already accepted and I was just now catching up to. When she nodded and thanked me, actually thanked me, I knew it wasn't resignation on my part, it was clarity, the realization that holding on to someone who had already chosen a different life would only hollow me out, and as we sat there in the quiet with untouched food between us, I felt the marriage shift from something I was inside of to something I was observing from a distance, already preparing myself for the version of me that would exist after she left. I found out later that the offer hadn't been sudden at all, that while I thought we were repairing small cracks with deliberate conversations and quiet dinners, she'd already been living 3 months ahead of me, mentally packing boxes, imagining a different skyline, rehearsing this exit while I stayed rooted in the present, believing the effort meant something, believing we were still choosing each other. There was something deeply unsettling about realizing that for a full quarter of a year I'd been speaking to someone who was already half gone, nodding along to plans she knew she wouldn't keep, letting me talk about next summer and next year as if those words were harmless. When I finally said out loud that she'd already made her choice, it wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, and the calmness of it seemed to throw her off balance more than anger ever could, because she had expected resistance, bargaining, proof that she mattered enough to fight over. She admitted, almost defensively, that she thought I would beg her to stay, that some dramatic declaration would make the decision harder, and I realized then how much of this had been shaped around a version of me that no longer existed, or maybe never did. That night she packed a single bag and left for her parents' house, moving through the apartment with this strange hesitation, like she was waiting for me to stop her, but I stayed where I was, leaning against the counter, feeling a quiet finality settle in, not cold but steady. The door closed without ceremony, and the sound echoed longer than it should have, leaving behind an absence that felt cleaner than the tension we'd been living with. Over the weekend my phone lit up with messages from her, swinging wildly between panic and doubt, questions layered over apologies, telling me she was scared, that everything suddenly felt real, that she didn't know if she was making a mistake, and I read every word without responding, not out of cruelty but because I understood something I hadn't before, that her uncertainty didn't obligate me to abandon my own clarity. The silence wasn't empty, it was spacious, and in that space I felt myself start to breathe differently, like I'd been holding my lungs tight for years without noticing. On Sunday morning I laced up my shoes and went for a long run along the Charles River, the air sharp and honest, my footsteps steady against the pavement, and somewhere between the bridge and the bend where the water widens I felt the noise in my head finally thin out. With every mile the weight of being misunderstood, of waiting to be chosen by someone who had already decided otherwise, loosened its grip, and for the first time in years the future didn't feel like a negotiation or a compromise but an open stretch of road where I could move forward at my own pace, uninterrupted. She came on Monday morning while I was at work, and I knew she would, not because she told me but because the kind of certainty she carried didn't leave room for courtesy, and when I came back to the apartment the change was immediate and precise, like someone had edited her out rather than moved her out. Her side of the bathroom was stripped down to bare surfaces, no bottles, no makeup bag, no stray hair ties on the counter, and the closet looked cleaner than it ever had, her clothes gone, her books missing from the shelves, her laptop no longer tucked into the corner where she used to leave it charging overnight. What stopped me wasn't what she took but what she left behind, because the wedding photos were still hanging in the hallway, smiling versions of us frozen in time, carefully untouched, and that told me more than any text message ever could. She thought I would cave, thought leaving the symbols behind would anchor me to the past long enough for doubt to set in, and I stood there for a moment letting that realization settle, not painfully, just plainly, like another piece clicking into place. I didn't sit with it for long, because something in me had already moved past waiting, so I took the photos down one by one, feeling the small weight of each frame in my hands, and packed them carefully into a box, not out of anger or spite but because they no longer belonged on the walls of my present. The apartment felt different afterward, quieter but not lonelier, and over the next few days I slipped into a rhythm that felt natural in a way I hadn't expected, running in the mornings, going to the gym after work, cooking dinners based on what I wanted to eat instead of what needed to be agreed on, realizing how much of my life had been shaped around anticipating someone else's needs. When a coworker invited me to a poker night later that week, I said yes without pausing, without checking in, without doing the mental math of whether it would inconvenience anyone, and the ease of that decision caught me off guard more than the invitation itself. Sitting there with a drink in my hand, laughing at bad hands and worse bluffs, it hit me that this wasn't rebellion or distraction, it was simply space I hadn't been allowed to occupy fully before. Somewhere between those quiet evenings alone and the steady cadence of my days, I understood something that had been true for a long time but had finally surfaced clearly, that I didn't need to keep making room for someone who had never really made room for me, and that letting go wasn't a loss so much as a return to myself. Weeks slipped by in a way that felt both slow and strangely light, and somewhere in that stretch of time the narrative around what happened began to shift, not in my head but in the mouths of other people, starting with her family, who seemed to believe that enough pressure applied from enough directions might bend me back into place. Her mother called first, voice tight and careful, talking about sacrifice and partnership and how careers come and go but marriage is supposed to be the constant, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed but because I no longer felt the need to defend myself in real time. Her brother followed, more emotional, framing it as a temporary crisis, insisting that distance could be solved if I would just meet Vanessa halfway, as if halfway hadn't already been behind me for months. Even her father, Richard, the only one whose opinion I had ever weighed seriously, reached out, calm and measured, trying to reason through it like a problem that still had multiple viable solutions, and when I told him plainly that she chose her career over me and that I respected that choice, I meant it without bitterness, because respecting it also meant refusing to rewrite myself to accommodate it. None of them liked that answer, but none of them could argue with it either, because compromise only works when both people are still standing in the same room, and she had already walked out. About a month later I was pulled into a conversation I hadn't expected when a woman named Diana, someone Vanessa worked with, mentioned in passing that she was sorry about what we were going through, that breaks were hard and confusing, and I felt something settle coldly in my chest, not hurt but recognition. It didn't take much for the truth to surface, just a few careful sentences exchanged in neutral tones, and it became clear that Vanessa had been telling people we were on a break, that this was some mutual pause designed to create space rather than the clean line she had drawn in our living room. I didn't raise my voice or dramatize it when I corrected that version of events, I simply said that she told me the marriage was in the way of the life she wanted and that when someone is that clear you don't chase them down the road pretending it's temporary, you step aside and let them go. Watching that realization register on someone else's face was oddly grounding, because it confirmed that I hadn't imagined the finality of that night, hadn't exaggerated the clarity of her words to protect my ego. The dream she had been selling, of ambition balanced neatly with everything else, collapsed quietly under its own inconsistencies, and I understood then that my refusal to bend wasn't stubbornness or pride but honesty, a commitment to living inside the truth of what was said rather than the softer version she offered to make herself feel better afterward. I joined a running group because the solo miles were starting to feel like a closed loop, the same river path, the same thoughts surfacing at the same corners, and I wanted something that would force my brain to look outward instead of replaying old conversations in different lighting. The group met early, the kind of hour where the city is still rubbing sleep out of its eyes, and everyone had that quiet runner energy, focused but friendly, bodies moving before their minds had fully caught up. That's where I met Allison, not through some dramatic introduction but the simplest way, by ending up side by side on an easy pace day, matching strides without either of us making a thing of it. She was training for the Boston Marathon, and you could tell by the way she carried herself, grounded and confident, like she trusted her own discipline enough to not need to advertise it. She didn't ask what brought me there or why I looked like I'd only recently learned how to breathe properly, and she didn't offer sympathy like it was a handshake, which made it easier to just exist next to her without feeling examined. Our conversation stayed light at first, the kind of talk that fills miles without demanding anything, shoes, routes, which stretches actually help, the best place in the city for a post-run coffee that doesn't taste like burnt regret, and it felt sincere in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. There was no sense that she was mentally juggling 5 other things while I tried to squeeze myself into the remaining space, no distracted half-listening, no glances at a vibrating phone every 30 seconds, no making me feel like I was an extra tab open in a crowded browser. When we ran, and when we talked, she was there, present, as if being present wasn't some luxury item she had to ration. That steadiness did something to me, not like a sudden romance, more like a recalibration, a reminder that connection doesn't have to feel like negotiation or performance, and that being around someone who isn't constantly trying to outrun their own life can make you stop sprinting in place. Around that time my old college roommate Keith called me and told me to meet him for drinks, and when I walked into the bar he looked at me for a long second the way people do when they're silently comparing your current face to the one they remember. We talked about work, the city, the usual, and then he leaned in and dropped the blunt truth he'd clearly been saving, telling me she'd come crawling back at some point, maybe when Chicago wasn't as shiny as she imagined or when the loneliness hit at night, and that I couldn't let myself become the backup plan. He didn't say it with cruelty, just with the protective impatience of someone who's watched you accept less than you deserve and is tired of it. I didn't argue because I knew exactly what he meant, and when I told him I agreed, it wasn't bravado, it was recognition. I had been that man before, the one who kept a door cracked open and called it love, and I wasn't interested in living that way again. 6 months after she left, the news reached me indirectly, the way most truths do once you're no longer inside someone's inner circle, filtered and hesitant, delivered by someone who wasn't sure how much I already knew, and that was how I learned that the job she had uprooted her life for no longer existed. A major account had collapsed under her watch, the kind of loss companies don't absorb quietly, and leadership needed a name to attach to the failure, so hers was chosen, and security walked her out with a cardboard box while the office pretended not to look. When Diana told me, there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of justice or balance snapping back into place, just a dull confirmation that the future she'd gambled everything on had been more fragile than she'd admitted. Diana hesitated before adding that Vanessa had been asking about me, probing carefully, as if my existence had become a potential safety net she was hoping hadn't been removed, and I thanked her for telling me without offering anything in return, because there was nothing left to offer. I didn't reach out, not to check in, not to gloat, not to soften the landing, because I understood that showing up now would only blur lines I'd worked hard to draw clearly. When the text finally came from Vanessa herself, stripped of confidence and full of vague urgency, saying she wanted to talk, that she needed to explain, I stared at the screen long enough to recognize the pattern, the way crisis had a habit of sending her back to familiar ground, and I replied with one word, no punctuation, no justification, just no. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few days later she appeared at my office unannounced, standing there like the rules still bent around her knees, eyes searching for a crack she could step through, and when she started to speak I stopped her calmly, not raising my voice, not pulling her aside, letting the boundary exist exactly where it was. I told her, evenly and clearly, that she chose her path and I chose mine, and that this conversation wasn't happening, not now, not ever, because closure isn't something you take from another person after you've already walked away. People nearby pretended not to listen, but the moment carried its own quiet weight, and when she finally turned and left, I felt no triumph, only relief, the kind that comes from knowing you didn't abandon yourself when it would have been easier to do so. After that, she kept trying, as if repetition alone could wear the truth down, emails that started long and defensive and slowly shrank into a few desperate lines, texts sent late at night and then deleted, phone calls that went to voicemail and stayed there, and eventually she even showed up at my place, standing on the other side of a door I didn't open, because peace, I had learned, doesn't require confrontation to be real. There was no anger left in me by then, no urge to punish or lecture, just boundaries that I had finally learned how to hold without apology, and when she did manage to reach me long enough to say that she had lost everything, that her job, her plans, her certainty had all collapsed at once, I told her calmly that she chose to lose her husband and that those were different things, not to be cruel but to be accurate. I didn't waver, not when her voice cracked, not when she reframed it as fear or loneliness, and not even when her mother called, pleading in the careful language of someone trying to salvage dignity from a situation already decided, asking me to remember history and commitment and the woman Vanessa used to be, and I listened politely before saying no again, because history isn't a reason to repeat a mistake once you understand it clearly. Eventually Vanessa filed for divorce herself, framing it as a mutual decision, a controlled ending she could explain without admitting how much had slipped through her hands, and when the papers arrived I read them carefully and signed without resistance, without bargaining, without trying to win anything that no longer mattered. There were no children to complicate it, no shared ambitions left to untangle, just a clean split that reflected the emotional distance that had existed long before the paperwork made it official. The final call came from her father, Richard, and this time he wasn't trying to reason or negotiate, he was apologizing, acknowledging that what happened wasn't a single bad decision under pressure but a pattern he had watched repeat itself over years, a tendency to prioritize the next horizon at the expense of the people standing beside her. Hearing that didn't reopen any wounds or validate my choices in some dramatic way, it simply confirmed what I had already accepted, that closure isn't about getting the other person to understand you, it's about understanding yourself well enough to walk away without needing permission or applause. After the divorce was finalized, I didn't look back in the dramatic sense people like to imagine, there was no moment where I stood still and reflected on what could have been, because my life was already moving forward in quiet, consistent ways that didn't leave much room for nostalgia. I kept running, not as an escape anymore but as a grounding ritual, something that reminded me every day that progress doesn't need an audience, and somewhere in that steady rhythm my work began to reflect the same focus, the distractions gone, the second-guessing gone, and when the promotion came it felt earned rather than lucky, a recognition of effort that had finally been uninterrupted. I reconnected with Keith in a way that went beyond occasional catch-ups, the kind of friendship that slips back into place when pretense is stripped away, and our conversations became part of my regular life again, texts about basketball scores, sarcastic commentary about work, reminders that familiarity doesn't have to mean stagnation. Allison and I started dating slowly, intentionally, without labels pressed into place too early or expectations disguised as romance, and what stood out most was how easy it felt to be myself around her, how there was no pressure to perform or impress, just shared time, long runs, quiet dinners, conversations that unfolded naturally instead of being steered. When Vanessa sent a final message months later, owning her mistakes after therapy and acknowledging the damage she had caused without asking for anything in return, I read it carefully and replied with the same steadiness that had carried me this far, telling her that I hoped she found her version of happiness, not as a dismissal or a moral victory but as a genuine closing of the door. That was the last exchange, and it felt complete without needing to be dramatic. Now my Sundays are filled with dinners cooked alongside Allison, unhurried and unplanned, my phone buzzes with messages from Keith debating trades and stats, and my weekdays are anchored by work I'm good at and proud of, days that feel full without being overwhelming. There's no drama pulling at the edges of my life, no waiting for someone else to decide what happens next, no sense that I'm living on standby, and that simplicity, that honest, self-directed rhythm, feels less like a reward and more like the way life was always supposed to be lived.